Hi everyone, I'm Andie Nordgren. I'm the executive producer for EVE Online at CCP Games. And CCP is a game developer in Iceland, so I live and work in Reykjavik. Iceland is a special place, and EVE Online is a pretty special game. If you don't know what it is, it's a science fiction PC MMO where all players play in the same shared universe. So this world has its own history. There's a history book being written about it at this moment, and players have a lot of freedom to take their own initiatives and action in this world, which makes for a very special community. So I'm very, very proud to work on this quite unique game. It's on its 13th year now, I think. But it also means that as a software engineering organization, we have some exciting problems and some legacy code, and the code, I think we're dealing with a lot of things that maybe many of you who work in software also deal with. So what I want to try and do today is talk a little bit about what we have done with our organization. We have a development team for the core game of about 100 people. And then we have teams working on other aspects of the game, such as the billing platform and operations and websites and so on as well, who are also starting to follow the same principles that we started working with in the core dev team. So I want to try and take you through the journey of what we've done and see if it applies maybe to your world, hopefully. To understand the audience a little bit here, I'm curious to see, okay, so first the sensitive question maybe, who's a product owner? Okay, there's a few product owners here. Who works in an Agile software development team? Whichever role. Okay, almost everyone. That's really interesting. There should be lots of interesting reflections here then. I think that's, is there anyone who is a manager in a kind of Agile software development context? You're a manager, yeah. Maybe sometimes these roles are combined and so on, right? And I'm gonna describe a little bit the journey and how we were set up before we started making changes. And of course your organization looks differently, so you translate whatever maps or doesn't map. So CCP has been going for quite a while, like I said, and been working on this game for a long time. And they started with a pretty small team, and they were doing staged deliveries back then in ancient historic times. But the whole company switched to Agile in 2009, like a company-wide Scrum evangelism rollout where all the dev teams kind of switched to this method, in also conjunction with one big release. And I wasn't there. I joined the company in kind of mid-2010. So I joined the company that was set up in kind of Scrum, and when I joined as a producer in one of these product owner roles, I then got the Scrum intro from one of the guys in the company who had done the Scrum Master training and who was all kind of into making all of this stuff run. And there was a lot of work going on then with user stories and story points and teams and Scrum Masters and the whole, of course no one does Scrum exactly by the book, but there was a serious attempt to do it by the book. And the teams, to be a little bit more concrete, I drew some stuff here before to give you a sense for how we were organized, because there was also a kind of matrix organization in place around what we call people management. So a typical team working kind of on proper game features. Of course, I have some pure engineering teams working on backend systems as well, but if we look at the teams that are cross-functional with multiple roles and so on, you would typically have like 2 game designers. One might be a system designer, one might be a UI designer. You would have 2 to 3 programmers, some maybe a bit front-end, some a bit back-end on our own proprietary client-server thing that we have. And you would have 1 or 2 quality assurance people on the team itself. And this would be a cross-functional team that could basically produce features for the most part. Except when it came to kind of, like, the game has a lot of graphics and art, so actually the art team is separate, but they are cross-functional for delivering graphical assets into the game. So a little bit of split in these kind of cases, but this would be the general setup, and then there would be a Scrum Master role. Usually the QA person would kind of get the Scrum Master role. not a very empowered role. We also had some people with production titles who were doing the Scrum Mastering. And then there would be a product owner who would often have more than one team. And there was a lot of talk about how many teams can like a product owner have before they explode and so on. And people who usually ended up with product owner roles, there was a lot of debating of whether you should take like a really good designer who would obviously have kind of a lot of the product knowledge and make them the product owner, or if you should have them just do work and have somebody else take this product owner role, because it came with quite a lot of administration. And I think you kind of recognize this. So this, I would say, this was a pretty good Scrum transition. I mean, of course, everyone has problems, right? But this was a pretty okay organization with some problems, because we had then management by discipline still. That kind of didn't follow the team-based like organization. So in a team like this, you would have one person who was managing all QA staff in the broader team. So you would have maybe 5 of these teams and then some QA in other places as well. And you have one other manager who was managing the design team as a whole, and an engineering manager who would manage the engineering team. And then you would also have directors, like there would be a QA director who was supposed to kind of content direct, and you have a tech director and a game design director who were kind of responsible for these kind of crafts and areas. And I would say that we had done some transitions here where teams would become more and more responsible for delivering all the way into the game. As we started releasing more and more often, we would release the game like it used to be once a year, then it went to twice a year, then we started patching pretty regularly in between those releases as well. So we're slowly starting to move towards more of a continuous delivery model. And teams were pretty responsible for making the features, but following them all the way. We're known in the games industry for having a very close connection with our player base. So pretty much everyone who's on a dev team like this is sitting on our forums, on Reddit, on Twitter, like talking directly to players. That's the other question to understand the audience. Who's an EVE player? Okay, 1. All right. Then I'll keep explaining a little bit how the game works and so on to provide context. So a lot of connection there, a lot of feeling responsible for the features that we're shipping and so on. So this was pretty okay, I would say. Then we made a switch a year and a half ago now to a 5 to 6 week release cadence instead of 6 months, to mostly get rid of the horrors of planning for a fixed date and to be able, of course, to ship features more often to our customers. And this shift has made it possible for us to be more, we've realized as we have made this switch that we had a lot of things built into our team setup that were hedges against missing a delivery date. So we would go, we have to have 3 programmers on a team, because if one of them gets if you only have 2 and one of them gets sick, we'll miss like the date. And now that we don't have fixed dates anymore, we are actually starting now to look at, can we have smaller teams and be more flexible around this. But so a couple of issues I would say we had with this still pretty okay setup was that there were two things that would happen. These managers here, they were pretty isolated, because so you have an engineering manager here who's managing all the programmers across all the teams, and they became some sort of disconnected therapists that were meeting regularly and had one-on-ones with their employees, but since they were not involved in the teamwork in any way where the stuff actually got done, they both didn't know very well how their people were doing, because they would have to then impose themselves on other people and kind of ask, hey, how do you like, So then they were doing some kind of rumor-based management, which wasn't great. And also there was like, if you manage this many people, there was nothing else to do really. So you had some to be an engineering manager, you have to be like good at engineering to some level. Otherwise, we don't think you should be, managing engineers in this model. So then you have someone who's pretty proficient at engineering stuff, who's just doing one-on-ones like all day and has time for nothing else. And people start wondering, why do we have this guy here? I mean, I like my manager, we have nice conversations, but like, why? And they were equally frustrated because if you're a decent human being, you want to be a contributor to the stuff that's actually happening, you know. So, and when it came to teams, because there were like 3 and sometimes 4 managers involved in a single team, there was almost no, like when you had problems in a team, they were very, very difficult to solve. Because there were so many, or if you wanted to move people between teams, or you wanted to like change something, you had so many people involved that it was almost impossible. So our organization had a history of in the past it was kind of, the management team would kind of sit with an Excel sheet and try and move people to teams based on what we thought we were going to do for the next 6-month release. And this would be like the 6-month, musical chairs of who goes where, and am I going to be placed on some team that does something that I like, or am I going to be like, who am I going to work with? No one knows. And then we had some really good people in production and Scrum Master roles who started fighting back against this and started really championing like team cohesion and building stable teams, which was really good. But you still had these problems that were multiple managers involved. So the other thing that started happening with this setup was specifically around the product owners. And we tried like so many versions of this. Normally we would have someone in what in games we call it production roles. It's kind of, people who make stuff work kind of roles. So someone with a production title would take the product owner role because it came with all of this Scrum, what I call Scrum administration. So it came with creating user stories. That was what presumably belonged with the product owner role because teams were not always like proficient in writing down these things in that format. But you should have user stories. So, let's have someone make the user stories. And product owners would be in this weird limbo where they would become a kind of team parent. So because they had a mandate to make product decisions, that's what they were supposed to do, but very often they were not actually equipped to do that because this unicorn is very hard to find. If the way I define product ownership is very much in line with design thinking, where it's about finding what's in the center of this Venn diagram between usable, feasible, and valuable. Figuring out all of these things and like what should we build here in the middle that matches like these criteria, and presumably the product owner would be very busy with kind of these two here, usable and valuable, and the team would then kind of own the feasibility question. And that's the kind of the Scrum setup, right? Implementation goes with the team, so the product owner gets to define what the user wants and what the business needs, and presumably like integrate these two, produce user stories that the team then gets to put points on and decide, in collaboration with the product owner, product owner decides which ones go first, and team decides how they get implemented. But it turns out very quickly that, of course, the feasibility question is pretty critical to the discussion of what makes sense for us to build. And so we would be looking for these like magical people. It's like looking for a full stack web developer. Like, there's a reason there's some of these areas that are like, people focus on separately. It's because they're big enough to have someone like really own them. But so we would look for these magical people who knew enough about the technology to basically not come up with shit that wasn't feasible to begin with, which, and then they were supposed to also know a lot about the users. So then we would look for someone who ideally played the game or had this very detailed knowledge about it, which would always lead you to people going like, why isn't the designer the product owner? Or we would look for someone who had kind of the business side, which for a long time for us wasn't mostly, we're subscription games. So most people who work directly on game features could kind of ignore the business side because it's like, we make the game better, people keep subscribing. So that wasn't so complicated. That's getting more complicated today as we do more like virtual goods and services and so on. But quickly, I found at least that as I became the senior producer for the game and then the executive producer, I found that whenever I was trying to have conversations with product owners about, the direction that we were supposed to go in and strategy and so on, they never had enough skills in all of these areas or enough insight and knowledge to actually have a meaningful conversation. And I ended up always having the meaningful conversation with the team itself. And to some extent, maybe because we put some pretty junior production people in the product owner role, because it came with all this administration that we thought, someone has to handle it, but it's not very advanced maybe. And you could argue that, well, you should put a more senior person here who has the money and who has like the business acumen and so on. And I think that can also work. But again, then you miss out on the feasibility aspect. So the fastest way I saw to hack this was to go, well, if we see this here, finding the thing that's usable, valuable, and feasible, if that's the task, I mean, who's better equipped to do that mostly than the actual team that does the work? Because in a very changing environment, as soon as the requirements change, which they do all the time, you're going to have to rapidly reevaluate how you're going to get to where you're going based on all of these things. And if you don't have all the aspects needed for producing the whatever value you're creating in an abstract sense, like if the programmers themselves come up with something that's actually very complicated to test, they're not going to be able to figure out how long it's actually going to take. And same for the designers, they can come up with cool designs all day. If they're not possible to implement, they're not going to be in the game, right? So we started looking at how do we resolve this, and we tried all kinds of directions. And one other problem was that because the product owner had the mandate to basically make product decisions and priorities, but not the skills for it, these people were not very trusted by the teams, for example. And it wasn't really their fault. They were good people. They were just put in a kind of a bad position. So they would not be very trusted, but they were still by the organization empowered to represent the team and their capacity to make stuff. So the product owner would be in all kinds of meetings, and the team would be like, fuck, what are they saying now on our behalf? And there was this kind of friction happening all the time. And so, and at the same time, because the product owner had the mandate, they became a sort of weird parent to the team, where the team would also kind of abdicate responsibility for what they were working on, because it was the product owner who had made the decisions about what the priorities were and so on. Most of them, of course, in discussion with the team, but then when things were working well, the team had mostly been making the decisions and the product owner had kind of codified them. And then you start wondering, why do we have these product owners? So this is a little bit of kind of the context and history that we were in when we started making these changes. Do you have a question there?
Where do you get the requirements from, if not from the product owner?
Well, so that's the I'll get to it. So we started, and of course in our situation, we had amongst the people, we're the product we're working on is pretty old, which means that there's a lot of institutional knowledge about both the product and where it should be going. That means it's very easy, or it's easier in that kind of context to hand over more responsibility to the people who are working on it. Because in so many cases, the people who were working directly on the game features, they knew the most about what the community wanted, what would make sense for us, and so on. And they also knew the feasibility question. So they could come up with their requirements themselves in very many cases. But there's another, when we started to make changes to this, we were looking at a couple of things, and I'll try and take you on some kind of journey for what we did. We wanted to solve some of these problems of accountability and also slow down, because this was kind of created this permission asking relationship where a lot of small things didn't get done because it was too expensive to ask for permission from the product owner, and then it had to be incorporated and user storyfied and approved by someone. We didn't have like a lot of heavyweight process. We're actually pretty good, but sometimes things are still too small that it's not worth it to start the whole kind of planning machinery for it. And so we saw some of these inefficiencies, and we wanted to try and make some changes. And so we did two things at the same time that are kind of related. So if we have a few questions that need to be solved, if we call the first one is like the what, when you can say the product direction, then you have a how, which is like process, methods, skill sets, and so on. And then you have a who question, which is a kind of staffing, who's supposed to work on what. If these are things that we need to deal with, we needed to kind of solve all of these at the same time. You can't just like fix one of them. They all have to have good answers. So we were looking. Product direction wasn't working so well because we had these product owners that weren't really there or weren't really working out and so on. So the question was, where do we place product direction? And my bet was that it was possible to place it with the teams. So we started by doing that. We said, okay, let's remove this product owner role unicorn individual that isn't working out so well, but let's keep the idea of product ownership, which is pretty well known because everyone with the team had, of course, worked with a product owner and had some, idea of what that work entailed. So let's give that to the team, but then, of course, ask what support do you need to actually be product owners. If you're going to take, as a team, you're going to take over responsibility for this whole question and the valuable, feasible, usable kind of Venn diagram, do you have what you need for that? And in many cases, it turned out that they did, and a lot of stuff just sped up really well. But in some cases, the valuable question, like the business perspective, for example, that was one of the things that was missing, or like a lot of teams didn't have a lot of visibility on that. And so to solve these kind of questions, we've kind of also, to solve the how and who questions, we've done a thing where we've conceptually turn the org chart upside down. This is very much value stream thinking, as in where is your value being created? And if you focus on the value stream, you kind of put teams who actually create the value. If this is some kind of representation of the value stream, you put the teams on top of the org chart, and then look at to actually carry out delivering the value. Some stuff the team has like capability to do themselves, and some stuff they're kind of responsible or involved in, but they need to collaborate with other teams or they need to some support to do it. And then the question is, what kind of support is that? And one of the key things we did here is to break that apart and say there's not one management support structure that's needed, there's probably multiple, and it looks different for different teams. So instead of this cookie cutter approach where we had tried to have, one Scrum Master should always be a Scrum Master for a team, and teams themselves would say, it's a problem that we don't have a Scrum Master, even when there were like 3 engineers working on like a very self-contained, pretty slow, deep engineering problem, which had very little process overhead. Why did they need a Scrum Master? Like, they didn't. And so there's a way to get away from the cookie cutter approach. So now I lost my thread. Let me see if I can find it again. Yes. So, and different kinds of support. So we're going like, okay, there's a there's a difference between these, like product direction and then execution support. And by splitting those apart, it gave us a flexible solution where we could say the team is the product owner, so they are responsible themselves and self-managing when it comes to choosing the direction and answering what they should be working on. And then of course they collaborate between each other, so the designers talk to the programmers and so on. Like I said, these teams were pretty mature already, so we didn't just like throw a bunch of people in a room and say, hey, figure yourselves out. You know, these structures existed already. But then we split off the sort of people management question and the process management question and said that that's one of the types of support people need. People can't just float around in a vacuum and not really know who employs them, who they negotiate salary with, who deals with performance management, you know. These are things that companies sometimes have legal obligations around and so on. And I think that we found a pretty clever hack here by giving the team itself self-management on the product direction. And then we stopped doing this discipline-based management, and instead we created just a concept that we call development manager, where one manager would be responsible for a whole team. But not for the what question, because that's the team as a whole, but for the how and who. So the role for the development manager is to basically staff a team appropriately for its function, make sure the team works in a healthy way. People are not like arguing with each other. It has the right competence. They have some process for how they work. They can, you know, if they make commitments, they hold them, for example. They function as a sort of participant in the network of teams that we have. And if they don't, there's someone who is employed to actually fix it. And this gives us as a company a very concrete way to have a team that works on those management questions, but in a way that doesn't interfere with the product direction. And those managers doing that, if we have a development manager here, conceptually they work for the team. Of course you can argue over these, like of course the people on the team, from a people management perspective, they report to the development manager. So the development manager is your like people boss. This is a person who can like fire you if you and put you on a performance improvement plan or whatever. So of course there's some kind of hierarchy there. But conceptually the way we work, the role for the development manager is of course to help both the team and individuals on staff to be as good as they can and have a good time at work and, you know, be in a role that they enjoy and so on. And the interesting thing with this is that we've been able to kind of upside down other support structures as well and say that, okay, the way we staff teams now, actually, like I said, they don't have a lot of direct skills on the business side. So I have a small support structure that I lead and our job is to equip all of the dev teams with the right business information that they need so that they can make good product owner decisions. But I see that as a service function. The decisions start with the teams. And we, as a general principle, we trust the team to make decisions, but we also trust the team to ask for help and seek out collaborations when they don't have all the answers themselves. That doesn't work magically or automatically always. That's why it's great to have these development managers who can basically facilitate and drive and make sure that process works. And then it's of course great when these people have subject matter knowledge, but is not as critical because they don't drive the product direction. But of course it's a fantastic help that the development manager who manages our art and graphics team has a background in that industry, right? Because it makes all of his help much more valuable. And he is also then a direct contributor in making everything work, is involved in like documenting what work are we doing, what commitments are we taking on, helping people express and plan and so on. So these people, the people with management responsibility, went from being these like disconnected therapists in their office to being directly involved in the day-to-day of the team's work, but again, without that meaning that they were owners of the what. And that has been really good in many ways because we can now look for a completely different type of person here. for the development manager. This has also become a thing where we don't have to look for unicorns of people and promote people, for example, who would really rather be senior engineers. And they're like, oh, we have to have someone who can manage like the engineers or who can do management work here. We can now find people who are senior in management and process and so on, and set them loose on making, the how and who work without requiring them to be super skilled in our product domain. It's pretty hard to find people who are super skilled at like EVE Online, and now we don't have to find that anymore. And we have also kind of up-downified all of these director roles, where we go, okay, the general principle is to have as little kind of centralized structure as possible, like as little as, not as possible, but as little as we can get away with and still be like functioning as an organization. So we have one shared product, for example, and one big legacy code base, and multiple teams working across that. It's probably smart for us, and the teams are actually asking for it as well. They are kind of pulling help from a technical director, whose job it is to support all the teams with making smart technical decisions across a legacy code base. It's not the technical director's responsibility to be the boss of the code base. It's his responsibility to support all the teams with what they need. And turning this upside down for all of these functions has meant that depending on what kind of team you are, you might be interacting more or less with these support structures, and we can make them as lightweight as they need to be. We can easily spool up new ones if we feel that they are needed. And we have, the development managers can also hire kind of extra help that we call development producers, who are kind of doing the same, the how, but mostly on the how. They don't have then people management responsibilities. So if there are teams that work a lot with like interdependencies with the art team or whatever, they can have like an extra production support that helps kind of manage that relationship. But when that's not needed, we don't have that. So it's really, really that has been a way to, I think we have kind of four of these different support structures. So, we're not very formal about it. There's really the management support structure, which then we have a team of development managers, and we work then together on running like a good team and good org structure. Then you have the art director, for example, who then works with all the artists to support them on art direction where that's needed, and so on. Question?
So you said the what, the how, and the who.
Yeah.
But what about the why?
That's a bigger vision question for the organization, and yeah.
That may be. So how do teams measure their success?
It depends. Yeah.
Moving in the right direction.
It depends on what they're working on, but mostly that's about looking either at usage of their features or the health and ecosystem of the game as a whole. And it's sometimes really, really tricky, like very, very difficult to know whether your change or somebody else's change made the impact, especially in a large, complex adaptive system like EVE Online, which is, this strange relationship between, hundreds of thousands of people who play, various game design systems, various technical restraints and technical capabilities, and third-party apps and tools and so on. It's a challenge, absolutely. So the whole, why are we doing what big picture decisions are we making, that's like a conversation that we now started having explicitly, because we're no longer spending time on basically moving user stories up and down in like some tool. And that's another thing with, another principle that we worked with is really to move as many decisions as possible as close to where the work happens or where the knowledge is, and let go of a lot of centralized control needs from the organization when they're not necessary. And this is where it's easy for a lot of production roles to create busy work to make sure they have a job. And this can be problematic. So when you remove some of these things, like one thing we've done, for example, is as a management team and as the kind of the boss of this project, I stopped caring entirely about how teams like organize their work. Because that's now a question for the team themselves, like how do you prefer to work? The organization pays for like Jira and Confluence. It's nice if you use those, but if you want to use sticky notes or Pivotal Tracker, or you want to use something else, you know, up to you, as long as you are accountable for your choices and you're a functioning like member of our organization. And if they aren't a functioning member of our organization, if they are, you know, make bad plans or don't ship anywhere near where they had planned to ship for planning reasons rather than we discovered some technical, you know, problem or whatever, then there's a path for that with the development manager to work with the team to figure out what's up, what's going wrong. But it means that I don't want to see user stories. Like, I mean, I sometimes look at them because it's interesting to see what people are working on, but the whole circus of how exactly the work gets detailed, prioritized, and done is something that, because the team is the product owner, some of it just falls away because the need to communicate outside the team with a product owner and another producer or boss who's going to kind of approve the priorities you've made has kind of gone away. So most of that happens here now, and we have a much higher level conversation. So I meet with teams regularly and we talk about what are we trying to do here and what direction should you go with your development for the next couple of cycles. And they have some project that they're working on and they say, we think we can ship here, but you know, we continuously evaluate and we're not going to ship if it's not done anyway. And I then trust that the team wants to ship the feature as much as I do, so there's no need for a sort of detailed planning and control system here. And that also means that I have no need to look at like user story points or whatever. Most teams stopped doing this completely because the value of that was to give people outside the team visibility on when they would deliver stuff, and that's no longer so interesting. Of course, we have this flexibility. We're not working for hard deadlines anymore. We're also working on a computer game. The cost of failure is maybe not so high if you work on an airplane or, you know, medical devices or whatever. You might have to institute more rigid processes for, or if you're delivering on a customer's deadline and so on, but you can adapt those. You can say, what kind of support does a team need to deliver on time? Then help them with that. And what else? You
said before one of the reasons.
It's a little bit of all of it at the same time. Like some of the needs to write a lot of conversation documentation in terms of user stories and so on went away because there's now a lot of decisions that just happen within the team. Like a lot of this kind of validation and permission asking has stopped happening because in 80% of the cases it wasn't needed. So now teams, if they need to go and validate, if they run into something and they go, oh, if we make this change to the game, it's actually going to have, like, it's going to be controversial. Let's go and validate. They might have some business impact or whatever. Let's go and validate with me, for example. Then they only take that part and kind of make it suitable for externalization. And then they can bring that somewhere and discuss it, which means that you no longer need to document like everything. But for the teams, well, like I said, when you have like a lot of interdependencies, for example, and there is some need to have a little bit more rigidity to what are you working on and when, because you have a delivery from the art team for some assets that you need and so on, and they are scheduling based on your schedule, then you write stuff down, and then we often add, you know, a development producer to the team that helps with some of this. Or the teams just do it themselves because it makes sense to them. So a little bit of all of it. Some of it went away, and some of it has become more relevant for people because it's just them and their stuff, and they feel their own need to organize it. And then some of it you can get help with. So what we've done is that the principle I'm working from is that you get the best results when people who are doing the work are talking directly to each other. So the general encouragement is that, well, you own your stuff, you own your schedule, you own your direction, so you can now go and collaborate with another team that maybe has, you know, maybe the team that works on some of our virtual goods features, they collaborate a lot with the billing platform team. And those two teams can then, without basically, they can have some planning support from their development manager, but conceptually it's the teams that book meetings directly with each other and just talk about how to make the plans that they need to make. So, and then we try and then work with, so that's what we're trying to achieve a position. And this was really cool to start seeing some of the results of this, where, you know, a couple of months after we shifted to this model and teams were actually starting to go like, okay, we actually have this agency. It takes a while, right, to realize that there is, the permission asking has gone away, and we can make these plans ourselves. And what's really important is that the collaborating team, that the collaborating team also owns their stuff. Because what we would see all the time is that if you have a self-managing team here, and I usually draw them like this is like the core ownership of the thing that you actually make. Say that, I mean, we have a team that's responsible for our websites, and they're written on the same technical platform that's different from the game, for example. So that's what they own. And there's a bunch of stuff where they are just autonomously working on stuff that they execute completely on their own. But then you have some other team here that maybe owns the, say the virtual goods features where you buy stuff in the game that also should go, then some offers or whatever should go on the website, for example. So now they are working on something that kind of needs capacity from both of these teams, and they can't execute alone. And what we would see is that in some cases we had the web team, for example, sits in another part of the organization, and they used to then have a more traditional structure with the kind of product owner here that would control their priorities, and there was a stakeholder group here that would basically look at their list of tasks and prioritize them. This direct collaboration here never happened, because when these people who were doing the work were talking directly to each other, even if this team was self-managing, when this team wasn't, there was no point in talking, because whatever you agreed to could just be like, you know, vetoed by whatever this was. So this collaboration doesn't really start working until all the teams have autonomy on the stuff that they can make commitments on. So in this case, when this structure went away and the team got ownership, now you get these really rapid collaborations where this team realizes, oh, that what you're asking for, exactly like you're asking, is hard, but I know a better solution that's really fast for us to do. We can do it like, I'll do it tomorrow, and then you have what you need, and then suddenly things are rolling like this. And people feel involved in what they're doing, proud of their work, their contribution mattered, like what they came up with solutions. And that's not just to be nice to people, even though it's much, much better to work like that. It's also to like, it's a question of how do you unleash all the skills you have in your organization. And if you put them behind basically stakeholder groups that are supposed to prioritize kind of pre-made stories and solutions, you're probably not using the full extent of the knowledge in your organization. So placing the product ownership here and trusting that teams will reach out and collaborate and validate and ask is a way to just make sure that all of this knowledge here gets applied directly to coming up with what's smart to do, rather than sitting, you know, behind like these externally prioritized schedules. What else can we talk about here? Question, yeah, lots of, okay. Don't know, you. No, I think that what I usually advise, I have some friends who are running startups and stuff, and they're like, oh, we need to hire like a product person so that we can stay in this nice execution mode that we like, and just have someone else deal with that kind of product side. If I was building something new now, I would just equip the team with product skills. Like I would put, you know, UX, product design, business, like, you know, I would put these functions on the team. And then the question is, okay, how big is the team supposed to be, right? Of course it depends. I mean, sometimes you just have to, the split is always about finding something that weighs enough that it needs like a team, and then try and you know, and sometimes that means that you maybe split. But then you find something that the business, maybe you make a little team of business and UX people who can together own something and be accountable for something real and be a real collaborator, with a team that can implement, for example. And those autonomous teams can find a good way to collaborate. So I think it's a bad idea. The intention with moving product ownership to the team is to then have all the skills needed on the team to actually take that responsibility, or provide them in support structures. So you might have a place where it's sense-making for you to make a small kick-ass engineering team, and maybe you have a product team that supports that engineering team with the product knowledge they need to execute. Or you could do it the other way around, where you have a product team and have an engineering team that's there to support. But it depends on where the... I mean, we kind of work like that now in different cases. You have engineering teams supporting other feature teams with backend stuff, and we also have, some teams are more designer and product heavy than others, and they provide support to other teams and so on. So it's a little bit of it in different places. And so this is what I always propose, is like if you place the product ownership with the team, I mean, what we see as well is that, of course, not every member on every team is like, yay, I want to do product owner work. But what happens is that the team usually self-organizes around this and says, this programmer here, she likes to be in a corner and just execute. And so she doesn't go to a lot of the meetings. But her teammates know how to ask her, because they work with her every day. They know how to involve her in the right places. And so the team themselves nominate. I mean, we have a super lightweight coordination system where every feature that gets worked on has one wiki page. And then we aggregate, and you have some details about it there, very, very lightweight, where you say basically when you plan to ship with some certainty. And then we can aggregate all of those pages to get like an overview of who's working on what and when do they plan to ship, which is like the one lightweight tool we have in the production team to follow everything that's going and communicate to the players what's happening and so on. But and for each feature, then the teams they just say, who's the contact person? In the past, it would always be the product owner who was the contact person, and then there was this, what's the product owner saying on our behalf, or like how, now they just say, well, someone's more involved in this feature than others. If you want to know something about it, this is the person to talk to. And that's different for different things and so on. And some people are never the contact person because they hate that kind of stuff, and their friends and their teammates just cover for them. And if that becomes a problem for someone in terms of a performance problem, well, there's someone called development manager whose job it is to deal with that. So you have kind of these things covered without them interfering with each other in the wrong places. There's more. I think because of the place where we're coming from, we just did it. Like this whole let's remove product owners is something I just did, and not necessarily everyone thought it was a good idea, but we just did it and then it worked. Or for many purposes it worked. But the more, and I have a lot of autonomy. I can be like a culture guardian as the executive producer for the project. The company organizes very much like, okay, here's one product, you run the P&L, it's your business, you make the decisions. Of course, you go and validate certain things, but if you want to change your management structure, go nuts. Within some, there's still some stuff that the company has like a salary policy that is company-wide and so on. So I can't just turn around tomorrow and start paying everyone, a minimum salary per month or do a four-day work week or something. There's some boundaries to what goes on. But I think that because we had these kind of disconnected therapists, managers who were doing great at kind of that, but weren't very involved, for them, this became like this splitting these things up and turning the managers into a support structure for their teams. It was like a relief for the people in those roles. And me and like 2 or 3 of my closest coworkers were occupying the more traditional kind of management roles in the project, and we were making this thing happen, so we didn't cause ourselves any problems. And then I had support from the C-suite in the company, or more in the form of, you do good things because you seem to be doing good things, we're not going to interfere. And then we've actually spread this model to more parts of the company. But I would say that so for these managers, it became a kind of relief, because suddenly they could step in and work directly with the whole team. They could be immediately useful. And of course you can, if you have domain knowledge, of course the planning side makes a lot of difference. Like helping people scope and prioritize. You can actually insert yourselves in a very like active and useful way, you know, but you're doing it in a way where you're working for the team. And so I think that not everything's perfect. There's still some issues we're working through and so on. But overall, I think that this was seen as a very positive change. And this whole change of when we've actually gradually over the year, I thought when we removed the product owners that I still needed people to be producers responsible for certain areas as the support function. And it turns out we didn't really. And so we've kind of halved our production team overhead over the year through some people just leaving and us just going, do we need to rehire? No, not really. And we've just really continued to slim down the production team because it just wasn't really needed anymore. Also because these fantastic development managers we have, they can fully step in and solve problems in their support role. A lot of the stuff that we would have these producer team parents kind of do before. Now there's a team parent, but in a much less neurotic kind of way. And also that the team knows that this person is here to help us. Even if it's my manager, it's explicit in the kind of org chart that they are here to help. But it's also, the reason this is a bit of a hack, like turn the org chart upside down, put the teams on top, and put then management and other support structures underneath, and give product ownership here. It's a bit of a hack because this support structure of development managers who then directly manage all the people on a team and are responsible for performance management, if you squint at that structure from in a traditional org chart, if you choose to put yourself here and look at this organization, it looks pretty familiar. You have managers here. They're called development managers, doesn't make big difference. This is a guy who manages that team, and there's a trust question there for the company that someone is actually doing performance management, someone is, making sure that HR matters get dealt with properly. These are, like I said, sensitive issues sometimes. It's like legal stuff. Who do I talk to if I'm ill and I need to take time off? Like, who do I plan parental leave with? Like, all of these functions. We still have that in a way that looks pretty much the same. It's just that conceptually now, because the product direction question is handed to the team, and this is seen as a support function, for those who work directly in this environment, it's a conceptually different relationship, but from the company's kind of obligations point of view and the org chart point of view, it looks very familiar. There's someone who, everyone has a boss, And so that I think that's is a reason I also want to share this, because I feel it's a little bit of a hack to take the product ownership role, which is a kind of a reasonably well-known set of responsibilities, give it to the team that executes, and then take the people management functions and have that as support for the team. And every other function as well, like what does the team need to execute? It's a way to keep a lot of traditional structures, but put them in the service of the value and from the value chain perspective. And you don't necessarily have to argue so much with sort of upper management, because you're not trying to come up with some radical org structure that changes everything and removes management titles and as if you're in some radical democracy project, which probably most company leaders don't want to be in. And it's the problem, I believe, with a lot of some of the methods that are being marketed now, holacracy or like radical kind of parts of self-management, is that it's just too much at the same time. And it removes too much of the familiar structures, and it takes up too much bandwidth. Like, presumably this has also been a way to say, well, most people are here, they want to go to work on the things that they have skills for and that they care about. Like most engineers, they want to go to work to craft like code, not to govern an organization or resolve tensions or like work, do production work. And this is a way to say you can be in charge of what you're doing, and you can get help with, get support with that kind of stuff. But the goal is to free people to work on what they have skills for, and so on. Not a single individual, but rather from different perspectives, and then there's lots of kind of collaboration. It's one of the things that we're trying to figure out now, how to take the team as product owner. I mean, I've set a fair amount of high-level direction in terms of what are we trying to do, how do we want to position the product, and so on. And then
So where do you go in the
I go in the business support structure. So it's me and my senior producer who is in that, like the senior producer role, and I have a monetization director as well, and a development director that report kind of directly to me. So the development director then takes care of the management support structure, and me and the senior producer and monetization director take care of the business visibility support structure. So yeah, for some definition of the same, because usually people, that's also like, don't do more coordination than you actually need. That's a way, because when you hand over, part of the really important thing about handing product ownership to the team as a whole is to say, you should take initiative. So what I would like to see is that each team says, given what we are working on, here's what we think we should do. And then it's the different support structures' role is to say, okay, how do we get the teams to talk together enough that they are, not clashing with each other, they're actually going somewhat in the same direction, and then whatever high-level vision do we need where people actually need to act on the same direction, let's figure out how we provide that to everyone, but ideally in collaboration, because most of the knowledge of what's going on is in here. So it's kind of also moving away from saying everything starts with the person who has the vision, and then they're gonna like push it out and down to all the teams as a kind of a starting point, whether that's for tech or QA or art or whatever. We've stopped saying like it doesn't start with you as director, it starts with the team and what they're product owning, and then sometimes they need help from one of these overarching functions. Yeah, I think so. That's kind of correct assessment. And I mean, if we were doing such a change, for example, we would probably do it in a lot of discussion and collaboration with the teams. Some of these changes, the teams see themselves that we should actually invest in something different than they propose and we support. But if we needed that kind of more radical change, I would probably then drive it based on like business strategy case. And then it's on me to present that in a way that makes sense to people so that they will presumably join. And then there's there's this balancing act. It's not like, agree or don't work here, but there's a point where if people can't be flexible and see what the business needs are, we have some kind of management problem that again, then there's a structure for solving. So, but it becomes more difficult. You get less control, but I would say that the control you thought you had with a traditional hierarchy isn't there anyway, and it's probably not giving you the control you want, and it's blocking a lot of efficiency, creativity, and execution power. So I would rather have this problem than the other problem. Yeah, they can drive. So we have, for example, our QA director and the development managers, they've driven a process towards whole team quality. And then they've sent people to courses, and and that's the thing, people can still take initiative. Basically, everyone's unblocked to take smart initiatives, rather than saying we have to have a structure first for how things are supposed to flow down before anyone can take initiative. So what I'm trying to do in general is to place initiative, power, and agency with each team and also with each support structure to drive good change. Make everyone responsible for actually the business as a whole to some extent. Like that's the peripheral vision I'm asking everyone to have. You have to understand the consequences of your decisions in the context of the whole thing. We're here together running the whole thing. You're not here to perform for your manager so that they give you a good performance rating. We are here together to actually operate the whole business. Of course, then we want to set up an organizational structure where on an everyday basis you can focus on what you're really good at and have your primary skills contribute as much as possible to the organization. But I find that there's also often an over-reliance, or like there is an exaggerated wish, which sometimes also people who work on teams champion, to efficiently allocate people in terms of doing what their main skill is. So often programmers will say, oh, I'm in all these meetings, I'm not working. But the way we're working now, that the whole team is the product owner, basically, or my bet with that structure is that if you as a programmer are part of the process of coming up with what makes sense for us to do, when inevitably your implementation runs into changing requirements and changing whatever changes around it, because you were part of the process from the beginning, you know already what makes sense, how it makes sense to respond to the new environment. Whereas if you didn't go to those meetings and you're just doing what the designer tells you that you should implement, that change becomes very expensive, because now you have to have someone explain, because you don't have the full context, you're going to come up with some solution that actually didn't solve the problem, but you don't discover that until you implement it, and the designer goes, well, wait, what? No, that doesn't actually work for this other reason that I didn't understand that I needed to tell you about. And these kind of handovers are too expensive. So it's in my view, it's better to have programmers not program and be part of coming up with what we're supposed to implement, because then actually making it is much faster. So that's the kind of bet we're making with that organization. So I usually tell people, it's like, it's fine that you are not programming or designing all the time. It's completely fine. Like I don't want to see your task lists. Like I don't want to see your hour allocation. You probably shouldn't be making an hour allocation, because why? Like if we have a high level discussion that your team is taking on working on a certain feature, I trust that you will work on it. I don't need to say, and I trust that you will do smart things to come up with what should be, implemented and so on. And that like trust built in removes a lot of weirdness. But like I said, you can put that trust with the team, and then as part of the kind of management structure, you can say, well, I know that this team is not staffed currently with all of the capabilities it needs to actually perform in the way I think they should. Let me think about how I fix that. Do I fix it with hiring, like adding like some skill sets to the team? Do I fix it by a process like, whole team quality or something else? Do I fix it by building a support structure that can provide teams with what they need? So you have a lot of flexibility to kind of solve these problems, because the expectation is not that as soon as you have a team, they know everything. But you can still start in the position that for the thing that the team is responsible for, we start by trusting them to drive initiative in that area, and then we can support with other things. I think that what we are doing is a sort of middle ground, and that's also why I'm interested in sharing it, because I think it's a feasible middle ground that gets you maybe 80% of the benefits of some of these things without throwing everything kind of into the wind. Because having people be insecure about what the hell they're supposed to do is not very good from many perspectives. You can say, oh, we have to force people out in this, but I would say that we are by placing a lot of these support functions really as service functions, then we're starting to see this kind of slow, like teams and support functions can take initiative to change something if we see something that needs to evolve. So right now we're looking at, do we want to make smaller teams, for example? So we started realizing that a lot of the structure of the teams we had was built for our previous release cadence of fixed release dates. So now, as we see how it works, we're starting to go, hey, maybe it makes sense to make some new teams and so on. And that's now then a collaboration between the existing teams and the people on them and the development managers. So we have a sort of soft process for similar evolution without kind of saying that that's the purpose. Like I've tried to be really careful with thinking that everyone can and should care about the governance of the organization itself. Like the split is sometimes made between self-management, which is kind of what we're doing with the product ownership for certain things. We're placing self-management responsibilities on the teams, which they already had in Scrum when it came to implementation. That's kind of what Scrum does, right? It says team self-manage when it comes to how software gets implemented. Don't self-manage when it comes to how it's decided what to implement, but for the implementation part, please self-manage. So we've extended that self-management concept to also include the product ownership. But then self-organization, as in the organization as a whole, kind of, like renegotiating the structure of how it's working is something that I think is more difficult, and it requires more bandwidth. Maybe more maturity, but I would say it requires more organizational bandwidth. So if you don't really, really need it, if you don't need to very, very quickly evolve your organization, it's probably not worth it to basically, because if you want this complete evolutionary, everything can be renegotiated all the time, you're basically saying that every employee has to spend some part of their energy stack, or energy like bar on organization and governance. And it has been at least my experience that it's very expensive. And if, like I said, if you don't really, really need it, you might be in a business that really, really needs it. You might be in some creative product development, consulting, whatever, where it's absolutely crucial for you. And maybe you pick the Valve model, where just as soon as something interesting shows up, you just enable it's complete freedom for everyone to just swarm around it and kind of make something new happen. But we, of course, have a product that is out there and that needs to run. And that, we need to staff a lot of functions for that. So in some cases, it's just no option. Like, sure, the billing team, people don't want to work there anymore. Let's not have a billing system. Woohoo! It's just not going to work like that. So for a pre-existing product, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean... No, but it depends on where you are, right? I would just say that if you... of course, the people who started the game back in the day, they understood we need a billing system, so they made a team for that. And now we still need a billing system, so we still need a team for that. So what I'm trying to say is that when you don't have a great need for very rapid organizational change-making, then it's probably not worth it to have everyone care about that. So in my view, you want some group of people who actually have skills in this, people who are interested in organizational development, who are interested in management, have those people care about how the org is supposed to work and treat that as a support function to the teams that create value. Because then you have a way to work with and evolve the organization, and people who have skills in that, they can do that work, and people who would much rather do the work where their skills are the strongest, they don't have to spend some time every week to be in a governance meeting that's about what the whole organization should, how the whole organism should function. And it's really a question of how much do you need that? How much do you need the speed? And if you don't need that much speed, it's probably not worth it to go all out and have everyone care about the organization as a whole all the time.